All right. So last week we talked about the exile in the Bible. And we looked at how Israel ended up really losing everything: their unity, their leadership, their power, their riches and glory, and then ultimately their home. So if David and Solomon represented, the peak of their kingdom as a nation, then their exile to Assyria and Babylon represented just the complete unraveling of all of that. They were really hitting a rock bottom. And all of this happened because they totally abandoned Yahweh, their God. They worshipped idols and they committed horrible sins against God and against each other. And we're going to focus next on a few of the people who lived during this time of deportation, of being kicked out of their home, and look at some of the things that happened to them during this time. So even though the Jews had been banished from the promised land, as God had promised to do, God also promised to bring them back. So they have a hope for their future, and they have a motivation to persist, to continue to exist as a nation and as a people group, as God's people, and work on their relationship with God and their hearts so that they would be ready to return when the time came for them to do so. But at the same time, they were told to really embrace their time in captivity as opposed to resisting it. So they had to live in this really interesting tension of maintaining their identity as God's people, as Israelites, while living in community with these foreigners that they would have otherwise considered to be their enemies and maybe look for a way out. And we see this in Jeremiah 29. And we talked about how Jeremiah prophesied all of this that would happen. And this was written before it happened, but about and actually, this part was, I think, written as it was happening. In verse 1 of Jeremiah 29, it says, "This is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the remaining exiled elders, the priests, the prophets, and all the people Nebuchadnezzar had deported from Jerusalem to Babylon." And I'm going to skip down to verse 4. It describes how it was sent and all that. "This is what Yahweh of heaven's armies, the God of Israel, says to all the exiles I deported from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Find wives for yourselves. Have sons and daughters, and find wives for your sons, and give your daughters to men in marriage so that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there. Do not decrease. Pursue the well-being of the city I have deported you to. Pray to Yahweh on its behalf, for when it thrives, you will thrive." So God is telling them to continue to thrive and to multiply as a people, but also not only that, but to actually pray to God on Babylon's behalf, to pray for the prosperity of Babylon so that it would thrive and prosper along with them. So we're going to go now to the book of Daniel, which you can open up to or click over to if you'd like to follow along. The book of Daniel starts off by where we have the perspective of the exile being kind of the big picture of where we're at. But this zooms in on Daniel and three other young men who were taken to Babylon. It's the end of the book kind of zooms out back again to the cosmic perspective, but we're going to start right off in Daniel 1.
Are we even going to be able to use that phrase Zoom anymore, David, without it taking on a new meaning?
Oh, I didn't even
Are we
think
getting a
of that.
video perspective now or what?
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know.
I'm still going to use it. All right, so Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. "During the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it." This is kind of just a reminder of what just happened. "The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning, are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach. And Azariah was called Abednego.
Yeah, so I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this passage, and you're familiar with a lot of the Daniel stories. These are some of the stories that we love to just bring up in Sunday school and to teach. There's just so many great lessons here, and I think it's interesting that some of the most famous Bible characters are from the period of the exile. So that's kind of neat. But I think there's some interesting things we should note in this passage. God handed Jehoiakim over to Nebuchadnezzar. And that's a different concept than when the Israelites went to battle to enter the promised land and God didn't give them victory. There was a difference between God not giving them victory in battle and then saying that God basically blessed Nebuchadnezzar and handed the Israelites over to Nebuchadnezzar. So I think it's an interesting turn of phrases here. It's a direct statement that God chose to give the victory to Nebuchadnezzar more than he just issued the defeat to Israel. The second thing I think to notice is where they went into exile, to Babylon of all places. I mean, this is not a good place. And this is foretold by Jeremiah. Jeremiah 25, 11, and 12 says this: this entire land will become a desolate wasteland, and Israel and her neighboring lands will serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. 70 years. Then, after the 70 years of captivity are over, I will punish the king of Babylon and his people for their sins, says the Lord. I will make the country of Babylonians a wasteland forever. So God's going to put the Israelites in Babylon for 70 years. And this is a place known for being really like anti-God. I mean, this is so like one of the first cultures as a culture to rise up against God would go back to what, Genesis chapter 11, David, the Tower of Babel, coming from all of this. And they wanted to build a tower to the sky, to basically to the heavens, so they could be in the place of God. I mean, this is a group that is not known for saying, oh, Jehovah, Yahweh is God. They wanted to be God. And Abraham, the grandfather of Israel, was called away from Babylon into the land that God promised him. So leaving Babylon was a sign of leaving the desolate wasteland to go to the place that God had promised. But in this case, God is taking them back to that place. A third thing to notice is that Nebuchadnezzar took all the perfect ones, right? Let's took the young men, the handsome men, the smart men, the ones that could learn, the royals. I mean, just kind of handpicked and said, okay, we're going to take these guys. We're going to leave the rest of you just out in the fields. But we're going to take the best and we're going to bring them into the king's court, which, again, is another, I guess it's kind of like a dig against Israel and against a lot of the people of Israel. But it was good, obviously, for Daniel and for his friends. But one of the things that really stood out to me was the mention of these articles from the temple. Have you ever wondered why the items from the temple are even mentioned? I mean, to me, it just really seemed odd. It makes sense that they talk about the people and the land. But it says that God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to take items from the temple and put them in the temple of his gods.
Well, and it's not just, gold and riches, it's sacred objects. So even if it's just symbolic objects, maybe this included the Ark of the Covenant and, other sacred items that had, sacred significance.
Yeah, and the Philistines tried that once, didn't they? And it didn't go so well. They remember we talked about the tabernacle going to the temple of Dagon, and how Dagon ends up falling face down before the ark. But these items are going to be mentioned later on in the exile story, and it's not going to be too good for the person who's using them. But I think there's an interesting thing that takes place here that helps paint the picture of what's really going on, because it's not just about the objects, and it's not just about the separation of the people. There is a shift that's taking place that Nebuchadnezzar wants to happen. And when we think of the objects and then we think of the people and look at what's going on with them, we get a bigger idea of it. Just as the items from the temple were taken and put in the temple of the other gods, the people, the royalty, the smart men, the strong men, were taken and placed in the service of the king, and then given names that refer to these Babylonian gods. Give you a quick little chart here. Daniel's name meant God is my judge. He was renamed to Belteshazzar, which means Bel, protect him. Bel was one of the Babylonian gods. Hananiah's name meant, what's that?
I was just going to say the L in the Daniel, the L part of that is what's referring to their God. So,
gotcha.
Same in Mishael.
Hananiah's name meant God has been gracious. Shadrach means the command of Aku, which is one of the Babylonian gods. Mishael, who is what God is. That's an interesting phrase. Who is what God is. Meshach means who is what Aku is. I mean, they didn't even get creative on this one. They said we should take God out of it and just put Aku right in there. Azariah, the Lord has helped, and Abednego means servant of Nebo. It was the desire of Nebuchadnezzar to remove the presence of God from the Jews and to make them conform to his ideals. And I think that's very significant for us to realize. Just as he took the articles from the temple and brought them into his God to serve his God, they renamed the exiles in names not after the God of Israel, but after their own God, because they wanted them to become a part of their culture and to serve their culture and to serve their gods. And I think this is the challenge of anyone living in a culture that's not focused on God. Our tendency is to conform to the culture that we're in rather than conforming first to God. And we can certainly see that in many cases, our own culture can draw us away from God and away from pointing others to God. So this is intentional, and it's an intentional visual and very daily reminder that that Yahweh is not the one who is on the throne, so to speak, of Babylon, but we know that God is ultimately on the throne. Now, if you're a Jew in exile, I think it would be tough to imagine being named as Yahweh to begin with, and then having that name changed to a different language and making your name point to a different God.
Can I think you out on the names just a little bit more?
Yeah.
So I mentioned that the L in Daniel or Mishael, the L is the God. So where's the L in Hananiah or Azariah? It's the Azariah, and also Yahoshua, which is Jesus' name. The Yah part of that is a shortcut to say Yahweh. So that's where God's name is actually embedded into their name. So it's just cool. You don't get that in the translation.
No, but thanks for bringing that one up. So these names, could you imagine bearing now the name of a different God? And that's literally what they were being asked to do. But you learn from Daniel, and I think one of the things that I love about the exile, is it right to say that you love something about exile, or that you get excited about something about exile? But the exile period reminds us of no matter how you're branded by your culture, no matter what your culture's perspective is, you have the ability and you have the and you can have the desire to live for God and to still reflect him in that culture. And you'd find that the culture for Daniel and his friends was very hostile to their faith. And when you're in that situation, you're going to find that you're going to often face a crisis of faith. choosing whether to obey the Lord, which could have really dire consequences, or cave in to the culture. And I think that's where we find Daniel and his friends in Daniel chapter 1. So if you have your Bibles handy, let's look at verse 8 and read down through verse 8 through 17. And a lot of Daniel in the beginning, the first like 11 chapters or so, the first half of the book, is very story formed. And then after that, it goes into a lot of prophecy and visions. So we want to, the story form parts, we just want to read through like it's a story, like it's the story that's written there. So Daniel 1:8. But Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Now, God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. But he responded, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have you beheaded. So Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. At the end of 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see. Well, the attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the foods assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. And God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meaning of visions and dreams. So Daniel faced this crisis of faith. He had to decide if it was better to fear the Lord or to fear Nebuchadnezzar. And so there's this whole thing about not wanting to defile himself. So what's that all about, David?
Right. So like you might go to, well, it wasn't kosher food. Maybe he doesn't want to eat the meat because it was, meat that was specifically banned in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But that doesn't really explain the wine, because there was no ban on wine. They're actually, wine was a big part of their tradition and customs. So no one really knows exactly what the motivation was. It could be that the food and the wine was actually offered up to the gods of Babylon before being given to the young men, which that would defile it. But whatever the case, Daniel was just convicted of the fact that he should not eat this because it would be defiling. It would be, it wouldn't be glorifying to God for him to do that. So that's really the important part. The why doesn't matter as much as just the fact that Daniel knew that he wasn't supposed to do that. So he believed that, he was convicted about that.
Yeah, and I think that there's a blanket statement I want to make, but anytime you make a statement with broad brushstrokes, it can easily be misinterpreted. So let me make sure you understand the context of this statement, but I think it'll help us remember things, remember the concept here. And that is that the beliefs are merely opinions until they're acted upon. Until you actually choose to alter your lifestyle around what you believe, then they're really not beliefs or true convictions in that sense of the word conviction. So here's Daniel, and he has this conviction that he shouldn't eat this meat or this wine. He could know it was the right or wrong thing to do, but until he actually makes a stand for it, it takes on a whole new meaning when he makes that stand, I guess is the way that I want to look at it. Your actions really kind of prove whether or not you truly believe something. You wouldn't sit in a chair if you didn't think it hold you up. You wouldn't walk on a floor unless you felt it would hold you up. You wouldn't eat meat unless you thought it was safe, just from our own perspectives, right? Some of you don't. I mean, some of you, if you're in certain places, you don't eat the food because you don't think it's safe. Our beliefs have to pair up and actually influence our actions. And I think it would have been easy for Daniel and his friends to rationalize why it would be okay to eat the food and the drink. I mean, I really do think it would have been easy for them. And And the reason I think that is because I can see things in my life where I've tried to rationalize certain things. So, for instance, God gave Nebuchadnezzar victory. So, therefore, it was God's plan for Daniel to be a captive. And God was blessing Daniel as a captive. I mean, he had the chance for a greater education. He has super food provided for him and wine provided for him. Why should he not enjoy it? Could it be that God was possibly using this king, the king, and all of these things just to provide in an exceptional way for Daniel? But I think we have to go back to our theology and realize that God never contradicts himself. So if there's a command not to eat certain meats, certain foods, or certain drink, you're expected to still obey it unless God tells you otherwise. And this was the conflict really that Peter had in Acts chapter 10, isn't it? So here's Peter, he's a Jew, and he's being told to go to the Gentiles, and God uses this sheet that comes down from heaven with all these unclean animals, and God tells him to eat it. And he's like, no, God, I won't eat this. He had conviction on that. So unless God, gives you some spectacular vision and shows you something otherwise, and I'd still question it like Peter did, if God gives you a command, you follow it. So I think we have to be careful, even ourselves, not to rationalize things away, but to take God at his word and to trust him, and to remember that we have to follow God and fear God above everything else. I think that rather than thinking that God has provided something that's wrong for us, it might be healthier to think that God might have put you in that place so that when you do what is right, he can become the hero. And there's a difference. In the former, you're trying to change God to reflect your circumstances. Well, maybe God is doing this so that I can have this. So you're trying to change God and his truth so that it can match your circumstance. In the second part of that, you're trying to change your circumstances so that they reflect God, your response to your circumstances, so they reflect God. And there's a big difference in those two perspectives on life. And we see this conflict is going to show up several times in the book of Daniel. This is not going to be a one-time thing. The culture and these Jews are going to clash quite a bit. So what was Daniel's response? I think this is another great lesson for us. Daniel did not demand or even defy. He didn't go on a rant. He didn't get on social media and start bashing the king of Babylon. He didn't attempt to call down fire from heaven on the king. Instead, he actually went to the chief of the guards and approached him respectfully and asked him if they could have something else. And the chief, of course, said what? He says, no. He says, I'm sorry, the king gave me orders and you are not the king, and I'm going to follow the king because I value my life. So he then asks the guard assigned to them to give them only vegetables. And that guard says yes and risks his life for them, which I think is really interesting. So Daniel's response was to have respect and to understand the authority and to appreciate the authority of these people and to share and his desire. But he ultimately understood that he was a captive. He has no right to demand things. And so God blesses them. After 10 days, they're healthier than the rest. Now, this is not a mandate for becoming a vegan. It's just throwing that out there, but they were healthier than the rest. They were given knowledge. So going back to the garden narrative, it was the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, or of good and evil. So God gave them knowledge. God gave them wisdom. You go back to Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7 that we've studied. And then Daniel was given the ability to interpret dreams. And that's something that we haven't really seen show up too often in scripture at this point. I don't think that anybody else has been given that particular.
Oh, there was one very significant person.
Who is it, David?
Joseph.
Joseph, yes.
And there's actually really a lot of parallel ties to Joseph's story and Daniel's story, interpreting dreams and visions for kings and how that, pointed people to God ultimately, so in a foreign land even. So it's very interesting.
That's true. Yeah, good call. Good call. So what happens to these guys? You want to read verses 18 through 21, David?
Sure, I'd love to. So we're up to verse 18 here. When the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians and enchanters in his entire kingdom. Daniel remained in the royal service until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus. That's a pretty incredible honor for these four who were interviewed by the king to be found so exceptional that they're described as 10 times better than all the rest. So God has clearly blessed them and honored them for living out their fear of him in the aspect of obeying him. So then we'll read on, unless you have anything to add, Mike.
No, I think it's important to understand how they've been elevated to this position now. I mean, they're now ahead of all these other people who helped Nebuchadnezzar even conquer the Jews, and now these four Jews are like at the top of the food, the top of their class, so to speak, and really being looked upon. From
their perspective, these foreigners coming in and just outdoing them in every aspect, it would probably have been, as we'll see, was very frustrating and annoying to them. All right, shall we continue on?
Yeah, let's read on. Go ahead.
Now we're into Daniel chapter 2. One night during the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had such disturbing dreams that he couldn't sleep. He called in his magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers, and he demanded that they tell him what he had dreamed. Not the meaning of the dream. He wanted them to tell him what the dream actually was. As they stood before the king, he said, "I have had a dream that deeply troubles me, and I must know what it means." Then the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, "Long live the king! Tell us the dream, and we'll tell you what it means." But the king said to the astrologers, "I am serious about this. If you don't tell me what my dream was and what it means, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. But if you tell me what I dreamed and what the dream means, I will give you many wonderful gifts and honors. Just tell me the dream and what it means." I think it's a brilliant way to, make sure they're telling the truth. And they said again, "Please, your majesty, tell us the dream, and we will tell you what it means." The king replied, "I know what you're doing. You're stalling for time because you know I am serious when I say, if you don't tell me the dream, you are doomed. So you have conspired to tell me lies, hoping I will change my mind. But tell me the dream, and then I'll know that you can tell me what it means." The astrologers replied to the king, "No one on earth can tell the king his dream, and no king, however great and powerful, has ever asked such a thing of any magician, enchanter, or astrologer. The king's demand is impossible. No one, except the gods, can tell you your dream, and they do not live here among people." The king was furious when he heard this, and he ordered that all the wise men of Babylon be executed. And because of the king's decree, men were sent to find and kill Daniel and his friends, because they're in that category now. It's interesting.
Yeah, that reply from the astrologers is really, I think it's like clutch, because they make a statement that would be very true of any people group on the earth at that time other than the Jews. No one on earth can tell the king the dream. So David, you pointed out that there is someone who's been known to interpret dreams.
Yes.
And so the Jews would be
history, they wouldn't know.
Exactly. No king has ever asked for something like this before. And that's probably a true statement. And I think if I was one of those magicians or astrologers, I would be like petrified. Like, yeah, okay, I'm not just going to guess at the king's dream and be wrong and be beheaded in front of my friends. And then the last statement was, only the gods know dreams. And there is a hint of truth to that. And I say a hint of truth, only God knows dreams. And the gods, then the other gods, the false gods, don't. So there is some truth to that statement. But this would be the mindset of the Babylonians, that only the gods could give this kind of interpretation and this kind of input. So the king does the only thing he can think of. He gets so mad that he orders all the wise men of Babylon to be killed. Now, just for the record, it is not a wise move to kill off all of your wise men. But he's just so mad. He's like upset.
And I think at this point, he's probably come to the conclusion that they're all just full of baloney, and none of them actually have any wisdom after all, because they've just been faking it this whole time. I think that's probably what he's thinking. But it's definitely, I think, a bit extreme.
Oh, definitely. And also remember, the dream disturbed the king. So this wasn't a dream that was just like, oh, I'm curious. He was actually shaken by the dream that he saw because he didn't understand what it meant. He's going to find out what it means. It's going to be good news for him, but he doesn't know that at this point. And so I think that there's this urgency in his life as well, because he doesn't know what this dream is about. And he really needs to know that. So let's see what happens with Daniel's response again, because again, now we have this other situation where his life is now on the line because he's one of the wise guys. And so Daniel chapter 2, verse 14. When Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, came to kill them, Daniel handled the situation with wisdom and discretion. And he asked Arioch, why has the king issued such a harsh decree? So Arioch told him all that had happened, and Daniel went at once to see the king and requested more time to tell the king what the dream meant. Then Daniel went home and told his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, what had happened. And he urged them to ask the God of heaven to show them his mercy by telling them the secret, so they would not be executed along with the other wise men of Babylon. That night, the secret was revealed to Daniel in a vision. And Daniel praised the God of heaven. So Daniel's response, again, is one of those responses that we can learn from. He handled the situation, the New Living Translation says, with wisdom and discretion. And the CSB says with tact and discretion. The ESV says with prudence and discretion. He was wise and careful in how he responded. And he didn't talk bad about the king, and he didn't make any threats. He simply asked the king, he asked why the king would make the decree. And then he asked to speak to the king. Now, that's not something you would normally do. It could cost you your life, but you already have a death sentence, so you really have nothing to lose if you're in Daniel's shoes. You might as well ask to see the king. And then he asked for time. But one of the most important and significant things is what he does next. And he gets together with his friends and he asks them to pray. So just a quick question for us to ponder at this point. What do you do when faced with seemingly impossible situations? Do you have friends that you can call on to have them pray with you and for you? Do you seek God, or do you seek Facebook? What do you do in these tough situations? And I think it's so significant that Daniel had a friend group, a cohort, so to speak, that he not only went through these trials with, but then also was able to say, hey, pray, and that God will show me this so that we can live in this case. And they did, and God answered that prayer. So where do you turn when you face these tough situations? Do you have that prayer group? And if not, you need one. You definitely need one.
Just Facebook is not that.
Right?
And there's nothing wrong inherently with Facebook. I'm not trying to totally Facebook bash, but having, a close group of friends, and it can just be even one or two, ideally, at least two or three who you can really confide in and trust and, share what's going on in your life.
Yeah, definitely. And so God answers Daniel's prayers and his friends' prayers and tells Daniel what the dream is. And so I want you to realize that God asked for time from the king, but had no idea if God would answer his prayers. God did. And then Daniel ends up praising God with a song in verses 20 through 23. And the song really reveals to you and me the faith that's behind Daniel's actions. And you can read that for yourself, but I want you to understand that basically he's saying that God is in the control of times and seasons, even exiles. That God establishes kings, even Babylonian kings. That God is the giver of wisdom, just like he gave Daniel. and that God is the one who reveals secret things, even dreams. So his faith, you can see, is what's driven him to these decisions, everything from not defiling himself with meat to being able to call out to God for wisdom and interpretation of the dreams, and even the respect that he has for leaders. And to me, that kind of takes me back to Saul and David, right? So when Saul was hunting down David, David wouldn't do anything against Saul because he realized that God had appointed Saul as king. And I think that in this case, you even see in the commands that David Stelz shared earlier from Jeremiah, where they were to seek the prosperity of the nation that they're in, recognizing that God establishes kings and kingdoms, is one of those things that would make Daniel want to do the things that are going to be in the king's best interest, and to interpret those dreams, and to make sure that he's learning and doing all the right things there. So I think it's a pretty significant thing in his faith. And so in chapter 2, verse 24, Daniel, now that he knows what the dream is, he goes to see Arioch, the king of the guards here, whom the king had ordered to execute all the wise men. And Daniel said to him, "Don't kill the wise men. Take me to the king, and I will tell him the meaning of his dream." And Arioch quickly took Daniel to the king and said, "I have found one of the captives from Judah who will tell the king the meaning of his dream." The king said to Daniel, also known as Belteshazzar, "Is this true? Can you tell me what my dream was and what it means?" And Daniel replied, "There are no wise men, enchanters, magicians, or fortune tellers who can reveal the king's secret. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has shown King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the future. Now I will tell you your dream and the visions you saw as you lay in your bed. While your majesty was sleeping, you dreamed about coming events. He who reveals secrets has shown you what is going to happen. And it is not because I am wiser than anyone else that I know the secret of your dream, but because God wants you to understand what was in your heart." So there's a lot in this passage that just like screams at me. Daniel doesn't seek to get any special credit for knowing the dream, but Arioch wants to take credit for Daniel. So Arioch's like, "Hey, king, I found someone who can interpret your dream." And that's really not the way it played out, is it? No. Daniel went to Arioch and said, "Well, okay, why this order?" And then Daniel went to the king, but Arioch's like, "Oh, I found someone for you that will take care of this and interpret your dream." And so Arioch's looking for credit, but Daniel's not. And though Daniel could have asked for the king to spare his life and his Jewish friends only, he asked that all the wise men not be killed, which I think is really cool. And of course, you're going to see that play out a little bit later on in the story too. But the phrase I think that really troubled me the most in this was the part where it says that where Daniel says God wanted Nebuchadnezzar to know what was on his heart. And I'm like, all right, so God wanted someone who serves other gods, who has no interest in Yahweh whatsoever, to know what was on his heart. I just think that says a lot about God. And the fact that he was willing to pursue and even speak to and reveal things to this king who obviously does not know him. And I love, were you going to say something, David?
No.
Okay. I love the way that Daniel starts his reply to the king. And he says, like, "No human can tell you your dream." And I imagine if there was a pause right after that, it wouldn't have gone well. So you kind of want to just like run into it. No human can tell you your dream, but.
We mentioned Joseph. When Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, asked Joseph if he could interpret his dream, Joseph had almost an identical answer. He said, "Well, no, I can't. Only God can do that. But he told me what it means, so I can tell you." But so yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, and in both cases, they bring God into the picture and they make God the focus, and that's the important thing. So Daniel tells the king his dream and the interpretation. We're not going to cover that part in the message this morning because that's not what we want to focus on. But you probably have some good study notes on that. Read through that.
Basically, it's a statue dream, right?
Yeah, it is. The statue dream with the different gold, silver, bronze, iron, and clay.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the response of the king that I want us to focus on this morning. Ulysses and Parker say they're going to leave if we don't actually cover that part. Right.
Honestly, it'd have to be a whole separate topic, and it doesn't really have a lot of relevance to this part of the story. It's about kingdoms that'll rise and fall, and academic research on it is not in a total agreement as to which kingdoms exactly they were. So it's really not worth getting into all the nuances of it for the purpose of understanding this part of the story.
But if you really struggle with it, arrange a time to get together with David. So it ties into Revelation, which would take a while. Absolutely. Yeah. So there's a lot of
it's definitely worth
stuff.
talking about. Just in this context, it's not within the scope.
Yeah. So Daniel gives the interpretation of the dream, and verse 46 just kind of blows me away. What happens? So King Nebuchadnezzar threw himself down before Daniel and worshipped him, and commanded his people to offer sacrifices and burn sweet incense before him. And the king said to Daniel, "Truly your God is the greatest of gods, the Lord over kings, a revealer of mysteries. For you have been able to reveal the secret." Then the king appointed Daniel to a high position and gave him many valuable gifts. He made Daniel ruler over the whole province of Babylon, as well as chief over all his wise men. And at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be in charge of all the affairs of the province of Babylon, while Daniel remained in the king's court. Verse 46 is just insane. Now, perhaps because Nebuchadnezzar believed that no human could interpret dreams, he must have assumed that Daniel to be some type of god. I mean, read verse 46 again. The king throws himself on the ground in front of this Jewish exile. You just don't do that as a king.
Wild. Yeah.
Yeah. And then he commands his people to offer sacrifices to him and to burn incense to him and stuff, as if he himself is a god.
I think that really speaks to Nebuchadnezzar's, the humility that he had in him and the potential that he had for kind of recognizing when he's been wrong and taking new information and realizing, that something new is true that he didn't realize before, and having the willingness to accept that is something that not a lot of people, let alone kings, have much capacity for. But it's very, very important, especially when encountering with cross-cultural encounters, which really is what this was. So I'll stop there.
Well, yeah, we're going to learn more about Nebuchadnezzar, aren't we, in the weeks to come?
Yeah, the humility wanes a bit, but we'll get there.
And then verse 47, I think, is one of the main verses here. He says, "Truly your God is the greatest of gods, Lord over kings, and a revealer of mysteries." Now, while Nebuchadnezzar doesn't become a convert to Judaism, and he worshiped Daniel instead of worshiping Daniel's God, a man who thought he was God is actually acknowledging Yahweh as the God over kings and as the greatest of the gods. And I think that that's significant. And that really shows not only the humility of Nebuchadnezzar, as David pointed out, but it shows the reason why we have to live a certain way in cultures that are hostile toward God. So he appoints Daniel as ruler over Babylon. So again, think Joseph. And Daniel gets his three friends appointed as managers. So these men who refuse to defile themselves with the king's food and drink are now four of the most powerful and influential men in Babylon. Now, we just did a series of, we did a sermon on the wisdom literature. And, there's three books we talked about. We talked about Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. And so as I was filtering this message and thinking through what we just learned about the wisdom books, I thought, depending upon which view you have, Proverbs, Job, or Ecclesiastes, you can have a different perspective of what's going to happen or what should happen here. If you're a Proverbs mindset, it might appear as though God is living on the principle of just recompense here, and rewarding Daniel and company for being faithful to him, as if it's the expected way that God would act. The righteous are rewarded. I mean, Proverbs says that over and over again, that God rewards the righteous and he punishes the wicked. And so here's Daniel and his friends, and they're living for God, and God's just rewarding them because that's what God does when people live righteously. So that would be the Proverbs perspective. But Job might have a little different perspective. Job is going to be one of those guys, he's kind of like waiting for the other shoe to drop. It's like, okay, so when will all this turn bad? And they're going to lose everything that they've had, because the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And so Job, if you're Job, you're thinking, okay, well, it's good now, but it's probably going to end soon, and God can do whatever he wants.
It doesn't stay good.
It doesn't stay good, right? If you're an Ecclesiastes type of perspective, though we see a few righteous men prosper, it's the unrighteous nation that is truly prospering. And though God is the God of the Jews, he's given visions of the future to a pagan. You're probably wondering, if you're from an Ecclesiastes perspective, why they didn't just eat the meat and drink the wine and enjoy the pleasure of it, because that's a gift from God and everything else is vanity, right? I mean, isn't that the message that Solomon comes to Ecclesiastes?
And all of those are valid, because God was rewarding righteousness. But it's like they passed that one trial with the food, but then even much more difficult trials are headed their way. And the Ecclesiastes message, I think the wise thing to do would have been to enjoy the moment, when they were put into place, to not be constantly worrying about what's coming next, to enjoy what God has blessed you with in the moment and to make the most of it. So that's where, they seem to be conflicting, but they're trying to paint a complex picture of wisdom, and you have to kind of look at them all together.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree. And we're going to look at it and see how it plays out through the lives of these men in the weeks to come. And I think that's one of the reasons why you have these stories, is they're showing the way that God works, and that we can't put God in a box. The story is about God punishing Israel for their rebellion, but it's also the story about God's power and wisdom and understanding. And so the story ultimately is about God and what he's doing, and what he's doing for his people to redeem his people. But I think that the beauty of the exile literature is that there's so many things that you and I can learn from it, lessons that we can also grab a hold of, where we might not, we might be able to draw parallels to wandering in the wilderness, but we haven't done that. Believe it or not, being in exile is something that we are actually told that we are, as Christians. We are exiles. And so there's lessons that we can learn on how to live from the exile period, and living in a society that's hostile toward the teachings of God and the Word of God. There's many lessons that we need to grab a hold of. So let me just give you a statement here that I want to paste it in the chat, so you can kind of process it a little bit.
Huh. Where'd it go from the notes?
Oops. Sorry, I just took it out of the notes.
Okay.
There it goes. So, living for God during exile is about standing strong on your convictions, living your faith with respect to others, acknowledging that God is in control, and seeking his wisdom for how to respond to people. And we do not do this, we do this not so that we can have it easy or get a blessing. We do this so that others will be impressed by God and be drawn to God. And I think that's kind of a good summary of the lessons that we need to grab from the exile as we're looking at these exile stories. It's going to be, how do we live in a culture that is contrary to God's word? And how are we living in such a way that God is the one that's put on display? And that's really what a lot of these stories are about. But some people might not think that we live in exile, David, you know.
Yeah, and obviously the context of Babylon thousands of years ago, the specific situations are going to be different in which we find ourselves than theirs, uh, and we're living in, most of us, um, living where we were brought up or where we've chosen to go. Military folks might have something else to add to that, but uh, in general, you still chose to enlist in the military, knowing that you were going to be moved elsewhere. So there's this removal of context from that. But to reiterate what Mike said, that and we'll see this more so in the coming weeks, as we look at it, it really is a New Testament concept as well, in the sense that we're not meant to be, we are exiles in the sense that we're not of this world, and we're not supposed to be conformed to this world. So just to give you a few references from the New Testament that talk about this concept, of really famous one, a good one to memorize, is Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. So it's that idea of setting your mind on God, so that you aren't deceived by the lies that your culture may feed to you. And then John 17:13-19, this is Jesus praying for his disciples, which is another interesting theological concept for Jesus to be praying for his disciples. But he's teaching them and teaching us in what the words that he's using here. He says, "Now I am coming to you," talking to his Father. "I am coming to you, and I speak these things in the world, so that they may." Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't give you the reference. Mike posted it there. John 17:13-19. "I speak these things in the world, so that they may have my joy completed in them. I have given them your word. The world hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I am not praying that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. And as you sent me into the world, I also have sent them into the world. I sanctify myself for them, so that they also may be sanctified by the truth." So, and this is just a small excerpt of Jesus's prayer, and it's loaded with stuff. But the part that really stands out to a lot of people, and there's this popular phrase that has come of it that says, Christians should be in the world but not of it, and that's kind of referring to that tension that we may live in with various different cultures. And it comes from this passage. But notice that what Jesus said was not just that we're in the world, like we're just kind of sitting in it. We are actually sent into it for the purpose of pointing people to God, and living sacrificially to be redemptive in the world. So that's one way we follow Christ's example. And even with Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, we saw there how God used that situation to point people to him. So we see that exile in its various forms, just like with everything else God does in the world, there's purpose in it.
Yeah, and you'll find all throughout the New Testament, you can find references to basically us being citizens of heaven. I'm not going to read through it, but Philippians 3:18-21 talks about that, and how this world is not our home, and we belong somewhere else. And so just like the Jews, they belonged in the promised land, and God allowed them to live somewhere else, and told them to prosper there and to do the things that would help the people there prosper. But in that, doing it to reflect the glory of God was such an important thing. We live in a broken creation due to sin. And while we live on this earth, we are to live for God, pointing others to him. But because of sin, we will constantly be battling the the things that want to draw us away from God, whether it's the sin that's we struggle with inside of ourselves, or whether it's the culture that's trying to uh, entice us to walk away from things of the culture, trying to entice us to walk away from God and to live for something other than Him. We have to make sure that as we live on this earth until the day that we go to be with our Lord, that we are living in a way that points other people to Him. And so this exile really is very similar to the New Testament concept of being born again and born as citizens of heaven and living on this earth. Though I would say the reason that we're exiled is not because we've done rebellious things against God. That's not why we're in exile as Christians now. But we are living under the lordship of Christ, and we look forward to a
As
day where we
humans, we
won't
are
have to
because of
struggle.
Adam and Eve.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
But yeah, that's and Daniel, Jesus, the disciples, they were countercultural in a sense, but not in a way that they were trying to destroy the culture around them, but in a way that they refused to compromise their convictions, and in a way that they were trying to peacefully restore and redeem the culture around them. So and we'll see that more as we look at, there's, like Mike said, a lot more connections in the New Testament to these things, but we'll leave it at this for now, because we'll be going through the story of Daniel and others for a few more weeks, and so a lot of these themes and these topics will be coming up again, so we have time to kind of flesh those things out even more. The Bible is kind of cool like that. It kind of builds through repetition and patterns and themes to really get the point across.
yeah, it does. And just so that you realize, we've jumped ahead quite a few books to go from where we were to get to Daniel. We've skipped a lot of the pre-exile prophets, though we're referring back to them, like Jeremiah, and we'll continue to refer back to these prophets. But we wanted to follow the line of the kings and take you through what's going on in this storyline and bring the prophets into it. We may go back and review the prophets later on. But the exile was one of the things we really wanted to bring out. The exile is huge in the history of Israel. In fact, if you read Matthew chapter 1, it's broken down into 3 segments of genealogy, and it goes, one of the segments is the exile. It's like that's one of the defining markers of the genealogies, is up to the time of the exile. So this is definitely part of God's plan and part of God's timing. But the lessons are so many. How we respect authority, how we understand the way that we should live on this earth to bring glory to God, can even be by doing the things that help our governments, that help our society, as well as the Bible studies that we do. I mean, there's that balance in there, that we have to make sure that we're living in a way that's honoring God, but also respecting others. And so these lessons are going to be lessons that we really need to take to heart, and then ask ourselves, how are we responding to our culture? How are we responding to those in authority over us? How are we responding to our circumstances that seem to be very challenging in our lives? Are we responding in a healthy way? Do we have a lot of beliefs about God and about the Bible? Or do we have a lot of convictions and true faith in that we're going to live out through it? And I think those are some of the things we should be taking away from this exile period, and especially from the book of Daniel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm excited to continue to go through the story and being back to kind of a real narrative. There's some pretty exciting and wild stuff that happens in here that will be fun to talk about.
Yeah. So do you want to close in prayer, or do you want me to, David?
Well, I opened, so why don't you close?
All right, I will.